It's June 25th, 1876. The sun is already brutal at 7 in the morning. You're on horseback, dust coating your throat, your uniform soaked through with sweat. Around you, over 600 men are riding toward a valley in Montana Territory, a place the Lakota call the Greasy Grass. You don't know it yet. Nobody tells you. But you're riding toward one of the most catastrophic military defeats in American history. My name is Private James Wilkins, 7th Cavalry, Company H. And I was there. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where history stops being a textbook and starts being a story you can actually feel. Today we're going deep into the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And when I say deep, I mean boots on the ground deep. We're doing this through the eyes of a soldier who lived through it. Someone standing in the middle of all that confusion, dust, gunfire, and silence. Now, before we get into it, I want to be upfront about something. This is a first-person narrative account, which means it's a storytelling format grounded in real historical events, real places, real people, and real testimony from survivors. The character of Private James Wilkins is a composite voice drawn from the actual accounts of soldiers who survived that day. Everything he sees, hears, and experiences is based on documented history. So when I say I was there, I mean history was there, and we're going to walk through it together. Let's go back to the beginning. You want to understand what happened at Little Bighorn, you have to understand who we were first. The 7th Cavalry was General George Armstrong Custer's regiment. And look, I'll be honest with you right now. Custer was the kind of officer that men had complicated feelings about. Some of the boys worshipped him. They genuinely did. He had this energy about him, this absolute certainty that things would go his way. He'd been like that since the Civil War, where he'd made a name for himself as this young, fearless cavalry commander. By 1876, he was 36 years old. Still young for a general. Still that same fire in him. But the thing about absolute certainty is, it doesn't leave much room for caution. I joined the 7th Cavalry 2 years before, in 1874. I was 22 years old, born in Ohio, the second son of a farmer who'd survived the Civil War with all his limbs, but not all of his mind. I didn't have a lot of options. The army gave you 3 squares, a wage, and a purpose. That was more than the farm was offering. By the time we rode out in the summer of '76, I'd seen enough frontier duty to know the basics. You maintained your horse, you cleaned your weapon, you followed orders, you didn't ask too many questions. That last one, that's the one I think about most now. The regiment had been assembled at Fort Abraham Lincoln up in Dakota Territory. There was a whole ceremony when we left, flags, music, families watching from the river bank. It had the feeling of something significant, that kind of send-off that makes your chest swell a little, makes you feel like you're part of something. We were part of something, all right. The mission, as it had been explained to us, was to locate a large encampment of Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne who had refused to return to their reservations. The federal government had issued a deadline back in January. All tribes had to be on their reservations by the end of that month, or they'd be considered hostile. A lot of the bands, particularly those following the great war chief Sitting Bull, had ignored that deadline entirely. From the Army's perspective, this was a military problem that needed a military solution. From the perspective of the Lakota and Cheyenne, well, we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about their perspective, which looking back was a significant failure of intelligence. Military intelligence, human intelligence, both kinds. The plan was a 3-pronged convergence. General Terry's column coming from the east, Colonel Gibbon's column from the west, and General Crook pushing up from the south. The idea was to box in the encampment, force a surrender or a fight, and end the campaign before summer was out. What nobody in our column fully knew was that Crook's force had already been stopped cold at the Rosebud Creek 8 days earlier by a force led by Crazy Horse. Crook had actually pulled his men back and was sitting idle. The southern prong of the trap was already broken. We didn't know that. Custer didn't know that. Or maybe he did and chose to act anyway. That question, honestly, historians still argue about today. About a week out from Fort Lincoln, the mood in camp started shifting. I don't know how to describe it except to say that the land itself started feeling different. We were moving into the Powder River country, into the valley of the Little Bighorn, and the signs were everywhere if you knew how to read them. The Crow and Arikara scouts traveling with us, they could read them. The scouts were remarkable men. Mostly young, incredibly skilled riders, and they understood the land in a way that no amount of military training could replicate. They knew what fresh pony tracks meant. They knew what certain smoke patterns indicated. They knew how to read the size of a village from the trail it left behind. And they were scared. I remember watching one of the Crow scouts, a man called Mitch Bowyer, who was part Sioux himself and served as an interpreter. Watching him come back from a ridge one afternoon, and his face was just still. Too still. The kind of still that a man gets when he's seen something he doesn't want to say out loud. He told Custer's officers that the village was enormous, larger than anything they'd anticipated. He said there were more warriors than the 7th Cavalry could handle. Custer listened. He acknowledged the report, and then he kept moving forward. There's a version of this story where Custer was simply reckless, where ego drove him past the point of reason, and there's truth in that. But there's also the pressure he was under, the fear that the village would scatter before he could engage, that the other columns would arrive first and claim the glory, that he would miss his moment. It was an election year, 1876. Custer had political ambitions. People were openly talking about him as a presidential candidate. This campaign was supposed to be his triumph. None of that mattered to the men riding behind him, of course. We weren't thinking about elections. We were thinking about water and heat and the soreness in our saddles. But it mattered to the decisions being made above our heads. On the evening of June 24th, the scouts confirmed what they'd been saying for days. They had located the village. It was in the valley of the Little Bighorn River, and it was massive. That night the camp was quiet but tense. Men cleaned their carbines, checked their ammunition. Some wrote letters that they folded and tucked into their jacket pockets just in case. I wrote one to my mother. I told her the weather was fine and the country was beautiful, which was true. I didn't tell her what the scouts were saying. I sealed it and put it away and tried to sleep. I didn't sleep much. Here's something they don't always tell you about famous battles. The morning before them is almost always ordinary. You wake up. Your back hurts from the ground. You drink terrible coffee. Men around you are coughing and grumbling about the same things they always grumble about. The horses need water. The rations are bad. Somebody's boots are falling apart. That morning, June 25th, started the same way. We'd been riding through the night and into the pre-dawn hours. The column halted near a place called the Crow's Nest, a high ridge where the scouts could look down into the valley. Custer rode up there himself before dawn. What he saw from that ridge, and what the scouts saw, was something that had probably never been seen before on the Great Plains. An encampment stretching for nearly 3 miles along the river, thousands of lodges. Ponies, so many ponies that from a distance they looked like a dark shadow moving across the valley floor. Later estimates would put the number of warriors at somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500. Some accounts go higher. Against our roughly 650 men, many of whom would be split off into separate detachments, the numbers were deeply unfavorable. Custer decided to attack that day. He had reasons. There were reports that the village might be aware of the column's approach. That element of surprise might already be gone. He didn't want them to scatter. He wanted to hit them before they had a chance to organize a retreat. He divided the regiment. This is the decision that gets analyzed endlessly. He split the 7th Cavalry into 3 main battalions. Captain Benteen took 3 companies and swung to the south and west, nominally to block any escape route, but in practice, riding away from the fight entirely for a significant period. Major Reno took 3 companies and was ordered to charge the southern end of the village along the valley floor. Custer himself took 5 companies, somewhere around 210 men, and rode north along the bluffs above the river, apparently planning to strike the village from the northern end. I was assigned to Company H, under Captain Benteen's command. So I'm going to tell you what happened from 2 perspectives. Because I was part of Benteen's column, and I pieced together what happened to Custer and Reno's men later. From the survivors, from the terrain, from the silence that told its own story. Major Marcus Reno was not a coward. I want to say that plainly because history hasn't always been kind to him, and some of it is deserved. But the raw fact is that what his men rode into that afternoon was beyond anything they could have reasonably prepared for. Reno led his men down into the valley at a gallop. The plan was to charge straight into the southern end of the village, drive straight through, create panic, give Custer's battalion time to hit from the north. For about 3 minutes, it probably looked like it might work. The village at the southern end was a large circle of Hunkpapa Sioux lodges, Sitting Bull's own people. As Reno's men came across the river and formed a skirmish line on the valley floor, the village initially seemed to be in chaos. Women and children were running. Dust was rising. You could hear screaming, but warriors were already moving. They came out of the village not in panic but in purpose. Mounted, armed, and... This is the part that surprised Reno's men. Completely undeterred. These weren't men being scattered by a cavalry charge. These were men who had been expecting a fight, had been spiritually preparing for one, and were now riding out to meet it. Sitting Bull himself was too old to fight directly, but he moved through the village urging his people to hold. Gall, one of the most formidable war chiefs of the Hunkpapa, had seen his wives and children killed in the initial moments of the attack. That's the kind of thing that turns a defensive response into something else entirely. Reno halted his charge, formed a skirmish line in the timber along the river, tried to hold. The pressure was immense. Warriors were flanking around both sides. The firing was heavy and constant. Men were dying. The timber provided some cover, but it was also disorienting. You couldn't see much, you could hear everything, and the horses were going absolutely wild with fear. Reno made the call to withdraw, to pull back across the river and up onto the bluffs. What happened in that retreat was chaotic and costly. It was not an organized withdrawal. It became a running fight. Men were cut down, crossing the river. The water ran red. Those who made it up the bluffs were badly shaken. Some were wounded, and all of them were desperately short of ammunition. They dug in on those bluffs and held, and they waited for Custer. Custer never came. And here is the mystery at the heart of the Little Bighorn. Nobody survived from Custer's 5 companies. Not one man. Every soldier who rode north with him on June 25th died that afternoon, which means there is no first-hand account from the U.S. side of what happened in those final hours. Everything we know comes from Lakota and Cheyenne accounts gathered in the years afterward, and from the physical evidence found on the battlefield. What we believe happened is this. Custer rode north along the high bluffs east of the river, apparently intending to find a place to cross and hit the northern end of the village. He may have believed Reno's attack had created the diversion he needed. He may have believed the village was already in flight. He sent a messenger back, a trooper named Giovanni Martini, an Italian immigrant who barely spoke English, with a final note to Benteen. The note said, "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." That was the last communication anyone received from Custer's command. What Custer found when he tried to approach the river was not a village in retreat. Gall's warriors, having driven back Reno, crossed the river and began hitting Custer's battalion from the south. At the same time, Crazy Horse, the brilliant and calm tactical genius of the northern Oglala Sioux, led a massive force around the north end of the village. crossed the river further upstream, and hit Custer from the west and north simultaneously. Custer's men tried to hold on the high ground. Archaeologists working the site in the 1980s found the physical evidence of what that looked like. Spent cartridges clustered tightly in spots where men made last stands, then scattered and chaotic in the places where the line broke. You can read the collapse in the ground itself. It took less than an hour, possibly less than 45 minutes. 210 men, 210 dead, including Custer himself, found near the top of what we now call Last Stand Hill. He'd been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the left temple. There has been enormous debate about which shot killed him, about exactly where he fell, about the last moments of his command. The Lakota accounts are detailed and vivid. They describe the fighting as intense, compressed, and decisive. They describe warriors who fought with complete skill and discipline. They describe a battle that, from their perspective, was a defensive victory. Their village, their families, their way of life under direct attack. I think about Custer sometimes. Not sentimentally. He made choices that killed 210 men under his command. That matters. But I also think about the fact that he was riding inside a larger system, a government policy of removal, a military campaign that was fundamentally about taking land, a set of beliefs about expansion and destiny that were shared by most of white America in 1876. He was not an aberration. He was a product. Let me bring this back to what I actually experienced that afternoon. Benteen's column rode southwest for several hours, crossing broken country and finding nothing. No escape routes being used, no fleeing warriors, nothing. The order to scout in that direction had been, in the view of many historians, a way of removing Benteen from the main engagement. Whether Custer intended that is unclear. What is clear is that Benteen eventually turned back east, received that desperate note from Martini, and rode hard toward the sound of the guns. We could hear the firing before we could see anything. A continuous, rolling crackle from the north and west, heavier than anything I'd heard since stories I'd heard from men who'd fought in the Civil War. Serious fire. When we reached Reno's position on the bluffs, we found men in various states of distress. Wounded were being laid out on a flat piece of ground. Horses were down. Men were firing at warriors still moving on the ridgelines below. Reno and Benteen consolidated their forces. There was a brief discussion, and from what I understand, it was more than a discussion, it got heated, about whether to push north toward Custer. Some officers argued for moving immediately. Others pointed to the state of the men, the wounded, the ammunition situation. They stayed on the bluffs. I am not here to fully judge that decision. I was a private. I was given a rifle position near the south edge of the perimeter and told to fire at anything moving below the ridgeline. That is what I did. I fired my Springfield carbine at figures I could sometimes see clearly and sometimes only see as shadows in the dust. The afternoon felt very long. At one point during the siege, because that's what it became, a siege, a group of warriors pushed close enough that we were in serious danger of being overrun. Captain Benteen walked the line in that moment. Not ran. Walked. Calmly. Reloading his revolver and firing, telling the men to hold. I don't know what to make of the man, but in that moment he was exactly what we needed. We held. That night was strange. The firing faded as darkness fell. From across the valley we could see the orange glow of fires in the village, hear the drums, hear voices rising and falling in what sounded like both celebration and mourning. Because it was both. They had won a tremendous victory. They had also lost people. War is like that. Both things are true at once. We tended our wounded as best we could. The night was cold after the brutal heat of the day. Men talked quietly or didn't talk at all. Some prayed. Some just stared. I kept thinking about Custer's column, about the silence from the north, about what that silence probably meant. June 26th. The warriors came back at dawn. This time the attack was sustained and pressed hard. For most of the morning we were under heavy fire from multiple directions. The warriors used every feature of the terrain, the ravines, the tall grass, the ridgelines, with real skill. They moved quickly, shifted positions constantly, kept us pinned. The situation was genuinely desperate. There was a point, maybe mid-morning, where the firing from one direction became so concentrated that a portion of our defensive line was at risk of breaking. Men were down. Ammunition was running low in spots. The heat was rising again, and the wounded were suffering badly. We had almost no water. A group of volunteers went down the ravine toward the river under fire to bring back water. Those men were later awarded medals of honor for it. At the time, they were just men going down a hill with buckets because people were dying of thirst, and someone had to do something. That's usually how heroism works, isn't it? Not speeches or grand gestures. Someone just has to do something, and one person decides they'll be the one who does it. Around midday, the attack began to ease. By afternoon, we could see the village beginning to move. A huge column of people and horses and dogs and travois moving south toward the Bighorn Mountains. The entire encampment pulling up and heading out. We watched them go. There was no pursuit. We didn't have the capacity to pursue. We stayed on those bluffs and watched the largest gathering of Plains warriors since perhaps the Battle of the Greasy Grass, which is what they call this fight, move away into the haze. Then came the riders from the north, from General Terry's column, which had finally arrived along the river, and they brought the news about Custer. I will not spend a long time on this part, because some things don't need to be stretched out. We rode north the morning of June 27th. Terry's men had already found the field. We rode up through a landscape that looked like it had been turned inside out. The grass was trampled flat. There were dead horses everywhere, dozens of them swelling in the heat. The smell reached us before we saw anything. The men were distributed across several ridge lines and in the ravines between them. They had died in small clusters mostly, little islands of last resistance scattered across the hillside. Some were in the deep ravines, which told a story of men making desperate runs for cover that didn't work. I won't describe what they looked like in detail. It was June, it was hot, and 2 days had passed. The field had been worked over. You understood that people had died there, and you understood that it had been violent, and beyond that the details didn't add anything. What struck me, and what I've thought about for the rest of my life, was the silence. Not total silence. There were men moving around, officers calling to each other, horses shifting, but underneath all of that, a heavy, specific quiet that doesn't exist other places. The kind of quiet that a piece of land holds after something enormous has happened on it. I found myself standing near the top of the hill where Custer had fallen. There was a small marker already, or what served as a marker, his personal guidon planted nearby. A few men stood around him in silence. Nobody was saying much. Someone removed their hat. He had pursued this fight. He had made the choices that led here. And here he was. I thought about a lot of things standing there, about the scouts who'd warned him, about the 7th Cavalry that was now partly alive and partly dead, based on which direction it had been assigned to ride. About the village that had been defending itself and had now vanished into the mountains. About what this all meant, or was supposed to mean. I didn't come to any conclusions that afternoon. I'm not sure I've come to any in the years since. Here's the thing about history told from one side. It's always incomplete. The United States Army in 1876 called what happened at the Little Bighorn a massacre, a humiliation, a catastrophe that demanded retaliation. And within a year, the military campaign that followed had effectively broken the resistance of the Northern Plains tribes. Sitting Bull fled to Canada with a portion of his people. Crazy Horse surrendered in the spring of 1877 and was killed, murdered, really, in custody that September. The Black Hills, which the Lakota called Paha Sapa and considered sacred, had already been opened to gold prospectors. The treaty that had guaranteed the Lakota those hills was being discarded. That was the root of everything. The discovery of gold in 1874 and the government's decision that treaty obligations were less important than what the land contained. From the Lakota perspective, the Battle of the Greasy Grass was a legitimate act of self-defense. The village that Custer attacked was not a military encampment. It was a community. There were thousands of women, children, and elderly people there. The warriors who fought that day were defending their families. Sitting Bull had been having visions in the weeks before the battle. In a sundance ceremony, he'd received a vision of soldiers falling into the camp, upside down, which in Lakota symbolism meant they were dying. He'd shared that vision with his people. It was one of the reasons the village held rather than fled. Crazy Horse, who had fought Crook to a standstill at the Rosebud just 8 days earlier, was arguably the finest tactical military mind engaged in the Indian Wars on either side. His flanking maneuver that afternoon, leading a massive force on a wide arc around the north end of the village to catch Custer in a pincer, was executed with a precision that any military academy would teach. The victory at Little Bighorn was real and total, but it was also the last major victory of its kind. The army came back, and it came back with more men and a fury that didn't stop. By 1877, the free life on the northern plains was ending. That's the full story. Not just what happened on the bluffs, but what it led to, and what it meant to every person involved, in uniform or not. In the weeks and months after the battle, the country reacted the way countries react to military disasters. With shock, with grief, with a search for someone to blame, and with a demand for action. It was July 4th, 1876, when the news reached the East. The centennial, 100 years of American independence, and the headlines were about a cavalry regiment wiped out in Montana. The blame landed heavily on Reno and Benteen. Why hadn't they moved to support Custer? There were court of inquiry proceedings. Careers were damaged. Reno spent years defending himself against accusations of cowardice. Custer himself was transformed in death. The press, particularly the Eastern press, made him a martyr. Custer's last stand became one of the defining images of the American frontier in popular culture. Paintings, dime novels, theatrical productions. None of them looked very much like what actually happened. The army reorganized and refocused. General Crook and General Terry both pushed deeper into Sioux territory with reinforced columns. The winter campaign of 1876–77 was relentless, hitting villages in the cold months, destroying food stores, wearing down resistance systematically. Sitting Bull didn't return from Canada until 1881. He toured with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show for a time in the 1880s, which had a certain terrible irony to it. The great war chief reduced a spectacle for Eastern audiences who wanted a version of the frontier that was already over. He was killed by Indian police on Standing Rock Reservation in December 1890, just days before the Wounded Knee massacre that effectively ended the Indian Wars. Crazy Horse never made it to old age. He was 36 when he was killed in custody. There is not a single confirmed photograph of him. He left no recorded autobiography. What we know of him comes from the accounts of others. I think about that sometimes. The most consequential military figure of the Northern Plains, and we have almost nothing in his own words. The Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument sits in southeastern Montana on the Crow Indian Reservation. It's a strange and beautiful piece of land. Rolling hills, wide sky, the river winding through the valley below. In the right light and weather, which in Montana can change every 20 minutes, it can look much like it did in 1876. The grass is still tall in places, the ridgelines are still visible. For most of its history, the site was known as the Custer Battlefield National Monument. The memorial on Last Stand Hill commemorated the fallen soldiers. That was the version of the story that got told. In 1991, Congress renamed it the Little Bighorn Battlefield. In 2003, a memorial to the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who fought there was dedicated. The first significant recognition of the other side built into the site itself. It's not a perfect reckoning, but it's something. It acknowledges that everyone who fought there had a perspective and a reason and a humanity that belongs in the record. If you go, and you should go, it's worth the trip. You'll find white marble markers on the hillsides. Each one marks where a soldier fell. They're scattered across the ridges and down into the ravines, and you can walk among them and understand, in a way that no book fully gives you, how the battle unfolded. The markers show the collapse, where men tried to hold, where they ran, where they died. And there are now red granite markers too scattered nearby. Those mark where Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fell. They stand in the same landscape. That seems right. Why do we keep coming back to Little Bighorn? It's not just the military drama, though the drama is real. It's not just Custer's fame or his fall, though those are part of it. I think we come back to it because the Little Bighorn is one of the places where the story of American expansion shows its full complexity and its full cost. And it's impossible to pretend otherwise. For the army and the government it represented, the battle was a short-term disaster and a long-term catalyst. It accelerated the final military suppression of the Plains tribes and the forced restructuring of life on the reservations. For the Lakota and Cheyenne, it was a brilliant defensive victory that bought a little more time, maybe a year of relative freedom for the bands that had fought there, before the weight of the United States military and policy ground that resistance down. For the men who actually fought there, on both sides, it was a terrifying afternoon in June in a valley in Montana, with dust in their mouths and the sound of gunfire and the specific weight of a world that had already decided what it was going to do. Sitting Bull understood something that many people understood too late, that the real conflict wasn't primarily military. The military conflict was real, but it was downstream of something larger. A policy decision that the land belonging to indigenous people was more valuable than the agreements made to guarantee it. Once that decision was made, everything else followed. The Battle of the Little Bighorn happened because the United States government broke the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Full stop. The treaty had guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota. Gold was found there in 1874. The treaty stopped mattering. When Sitting Bull's people refused to give up the life they'd been promised they could keep, the army was sent. Everything that happened on June 25th and 26th was downstream of that decision. Understanding that doesn't make the battle less dramatic or less significant. It actually makes it more significant, because it connects the military events to the political and moral context that caused them. History is full of what-ifs. And Little Bighorn attracts more than most. What if Custer had waited for Terry and Gibbon? The original plan was for the 3 columns to converge around June 26th. If Custer had maintained the timeline, the combined force would have numbered in the thousands, far more than any warrior force could comfortably engage directly. What if he hadn't divided the regiment? 600 men moving together, even against a large village, is a very different proposition than 3 separate battalions operating without communication. The division of forces is the decision that most military analysts point to when they're trying to explain what went wrong. What if the Lakota and Cheyenne had dispersed, as some bands had done before? Sitting Bull and his spiritual authority, the gathering of so many peoples in one encampment, that was unusual. A normal summer dispersal would have made the Army's campaign much easier, but the political and spiritual mood of 1876 kept people together. What if Crook's column hadn't been stopped at the Rosebud? If the 3-pronged plan had worked as designed, the outcome might have been very different. These questions are interesting, but I always come back to the same place. The battle itself was a symptom, not a cause. The cause was a set of policies and decisions made far from Montana, in Washington, and in newspaper editorial offices, and in the minds of a country that had decided the continent was its to take. The battle was where those decisions became physical and fatal. That's what I want you to take away from this story, more than any tactical detail. The accounts that survived from both sides give you moments that cut through the distance of time. Wooden Leg, a northern Cheyenne warrior who fought that day, gave interviews in his old age that described the battle with vivid, specific detail. He described the initial confusion when Reno's men charged, the rapid organization of the warrior response, the crossing of the river, the final fighting on the hill. He described it neither with triumphalism nor apology, with the kind of straightforward honesty of someone reporting what he saw. He also described being very young that day, 17 years old. He'd grabbed his weapons and his horse and ridden out when the alarm was raised, not fully knowing what he was riding toward. He found out quickly. Gall, who became a statesman in later years and gave public accounts of the battle, described the moment he learned his family had been killed in the opening of Reno's attack. He said it made his heart bad. Then he rode. That's as close as the translated accounts get to his internal state, but those few words carry enormous weight. Kate Bighead, a Cheyenne woman, gave an account in her old age of watching the battle from the edge of the village, seeing the soldiers on the hillside, watching the waves of warriors, watching the outcome. She described the aftermath of the battle with a directness that doesn't sanitize anything. These voices deserve as much space as the official military records. They were there. They experienced it. The history doesn't make sense without them. Here's something worth knowing. The image of Custer's last stand that most Americans carry in their heads, the heroic general making a final stand against overwhelming odds, sword raised, soldiers fighting to the last, that image was largely invented. The most famous painting of the battle, Custer's Last Fight by Cassidy Adams, was reproduced by Anheuser-Busch and distributed to bars and taverns across the country in the late 19th century. Millions of Americans saw that image. It showed Custer with long golden hair, sword raised, surrounded by chaos, but defiant and heroic. The actual Custer had cut his hair short before the campaign. He was not carrying a sword. Cavalry didn't typically use sabers in the Indian Wars. The battle almost certainly didn't look anything like the painting. But the painting shaped the mythology, and the mythology shaped how the story got told for the better part of a century. It took a long time for the other version to gain traction. The version that includes Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and Gall as the full human beings and leaders they were, not just as backdrop to a story about a cavalry general. That shift is still happening, the renaming of the monument, the red granite markers, the scholarship of the last 40 years, the accounts of Lakota and Cheyenne historians and descendants. The real story is more complicated than the painting. It's also more interesting, more true, more useful as a way of understanding where we came from and how we got here. So here I am, Private James Wilkins, 7th Cavalry, Company H, survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Rider with Bentine's column, one of the men who held the bluffs for 2 days while Custer's battalion lay silent on the hills to the north. I mustered out of the army in 1879, went back to Ohio, worked in a mill, then a hardware store, got married, had children, watched the world change in ways that seemed impossible when I was a young man riding across the Montana Territory with dust in my hair and a Springfield carbine across my saddle. Did I feel lucky? Yes, the kind of luck that weighs on you a little. I was in Bentine's column, not Custer's. That was the difference between riding home and not riding home. I didn't do anything to earn that assignment. It was just where I was put. The men in Custer's column, I knew some of them, drank bad coffee with them, complained about the same things, shared the same bad roads and worse rations. They weren't different from me in any important way. They were just in a different company. I've read what people have written about Little Bighorn over the years. The books that make Custer a hero, the books that make him a villain. The books that treat the whole thing as a military puzzle to be solved. Each of those versions captures something. None of them captures all of it. What I know, what I carry from being there, is simpler and harder than any of those versions. People died for reasons that had very little to do with them personally. Men in blue uniforms and warriors in paint, all of them caught up in something vast and decided at levels far above them. A policy, a treaty broken, a land that people wanted, a people who refused to disappear. The valley of the Little Bighorn holds all of that. It held it that June, and it holds it now. If you go there and stand on those bluffs on a quiet afternoon, looking out over the grass and the river, you can feel it. That's what I'd tell you to do. Go and stand there, listen to the silence. It has a lot to say. So there it is. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, from the ground up. We covered a lot of territory today. The build-up, the politics, the military decisions, the fighting itself, the aftermath, the mythology, and the history that gets told when we're willing to listen to everyone who was there. A few things I want you to hold on to from this video. The battle did not happen in a vacuum. It was the product of specific policy decisions, treaty violations, the demand for indigenous land, that set everything else in motion. Understanding the cause matters as much as understanding the battle. Custer was neither the hero of the painting nor a simple cartoon villain. He was a product of his time, operating inside a system, making choices within that system that had fatal consequences for the men under his command, and that accelerated the suffering of the people his campaign was targeting. The warriors who fought at Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Gall, Wooden Leg, and thousands of others were not a backdrop. They were the central actors in this story, defending their homes and their way of life with real skill and courage. And the people who survived on both sides, the soldiers on the bluffs, the families in the village, carried the weight of those 2 days for the rest of their lives in ways that don't fit into any painting or any mythology. History is complicated. That's not a reason to avoid it. That's the reason to keep digging. If you found this video worthwhile, hit subscribe. We do this kind of immersive, first-person historical storytelling regularly, and there's a lot more to come. Drop a comment below and let me know which battle or historical event you'd like us to cover next. There are hundreds of stories like this one. Moments where history pivoted, where ordinary people found themselves inside extraordinary events and had to figure out how to survive. And if you want to go deeper on Little Bighorn specifically, I genuinely recommend starting with the oral histories. The accounts of Wooden Leg, Kate Bighead, and Gall, which are available in several compiled collections. Then read the archaeological analysis from the 1983 to 84 excavations, which fundamentally changed how we understand the battle's final minutes. And visit the site if you can. Some places can only be understood by standing in them. That's all from me. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious. Subscribe for more first-person history. Next video, I was at the Siege of Stalingrad. A Soldier's Account, 1942.